The chair sat empty that October morning in 1953, and Frank Miller would spend the rest of his life wishing he had been sitting in it. The wind carried smoke across his Kansas wheat fields, black and thick, rolling from the direction of the Henderson's place 3 miles east. Frank stood at his kitchen window, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, watching that dark column rise against the pale dawn sky. His wife Martha grabbed the phone, hand shaking as she cranked the handle. The operator's voice came through crackling with static and fear. Fire had jumped the creek. The Hendersons were cut off. Frank's boots hammered across the wooden porch as he ran for his truck. But he stopped dead when he saw Old Man Carlson already sitting in that chair by his front door, whittling stick abandoned in his lap, eyes fixed on that distant smoke. The 78-year-old neighbor had walked the half-mile from his place in the pre-dawn darkness. He did not say a word. He just sat there waiting, the way farmers had waited in chairs by doors for 100 years before that morning. Frank understood immediately. Carlson had seen the smoke before Frank had. He had known Frank would need help. He had known where to come and exactly where Frank would find him. That chair was not decoration. It was not furniture. It was a system of survival older than anyone could remember. And by the time the sun set that October day, Frank Miller would understand why his grandfather had beaten the importance of that chair into him with words sharper than any belt. The old man had grabbed 12-year-old Frank by the shoulders one summer evening in 1937 and said, "You keep that chair by the door, boy. You keep it clean, you keep it ready, because the day you need it, you will not have time to go looking." Frank had thought his grandfather was talking about having a place to pull off muddy boots. He had been 16 years younger and infinitely more stupid. The chair by the door was not one tradition. It was 7 different survival systems compressed into one piece of furniture, each one developed through generations of farmers learning hard lessons in the hardest school that ever existed, the American prairie, where your nearest neighbor might be 3 miles away and help might not come unless you had a system for calling it. The chair served as a watchtower, a meeting place, a medical station, a message board, a barrier against disease, a test of character, and a symbol so powerful that its absence could destroy a family's reputation for 3 generations. Frank's grandfather had kept his chair on the south side of his door because the prevailing winds came from the north. He could sit with his back to the wind and watch the road without dust and grit blowing in his face. He had carved a small notch in the right armrest for every year he farmed that land. 43 notches. 43 years of sitting in that chair at sunrise and sunset, scanning the horizon for trouble that might be coming or neighbors who might need to find him. Frank's father had kept the same chair, same spot, adding his own notches until a tractor accident in 1949 left him unable to climb stairs. That chair moved to the new house Frank built, and it sat by Frank's door now, worn smooth by 3 generations of Miller men who understood what the chair meant, or thought they did. Old Man Carlson did not sit in Frank's chair that morning. That would have violated protocol so fundamental it did not need speaking. You did not sit in another man's chair unless invited, and you did not get invited unless you had proven yourself through blood, fire, or time. Carlson had proven himself through all 3. He sat on the porch rail instead, proper distance maintained, and when Frank came out pulling on his coat, Carlson pointed east with the knife he used for whittling. "Henderson's oldest boy rode past my place 20 minutes ago. Horse was lathered. Boy did not stop. Fire started in their equipment shed around 4 this morning. Jumped to the house by 4:15. They got the children out, but George Henderson went back in for the lockbox with their deed and mortgage papers." Frank felt his stomach drop. "Did he make it out?" "Boy did not stop to tell me." Carlson folded his knife with fingers gnarled from 60 years of farm work. "But he was riding northwest away from town, toward Doc Miller's place. Make of that what you will." Frank was in his truck before Carlson finished speaking, but the old man was already climbing into the passenger seat, moving with the deliberate speed of someone who had learned long ago that rushing caused mistakes, and mistakes cost lives. They were rolling down the dirt road before Frank realized what Carlson had just done. The old man had given Frank a 5-minute head start on information that would take the phone tree another 15 minutes to spread. He had decoded the meaning of a boy on a lathered horse riding in a specific direction. He had positioned himself at Frank's door in the dark before dawn because he knew Frank would need experienced help, and he knew exactly where to wait to provide it. The chair-by-the-door system was not about furniture. It was about location intelligence in an era before cell phones and CB radios, when information moved at the speed of horses, and the difference between life and death could be measured in minutes of warning time. A man sitting in a chair by his front door could see a rider approaching from a mile away on flat prairie land. He could read the speed of the horse, the posture of the rider, the direction they came from and the direction they were heading. He could determine whether this was a social call or an emergency before the rider arrived at his porch. He could be ready with the right response: a cup of coffee, a team of horses, a medical kit, or a loaded shotgun. Doc Miller's place was 7 miles northwest on roads that turned to soup when it rained and corrugated nightmares when they dried. Frank pushed his 1948 Ford pickup hard enough that Carlson braced himself against the dashboard without comment. They passed the Johnsons' farm at 6:03 in the morning. Frank saw movement by their door. 2 men he did not immediately recognize sat in chairs someone had dragged outside. They stood when they saw Frank's truck. One pointed east, confirming the fire's location. The other held up 5 fingers, then made a winding motion with his hand. 5 wagons coming up the creek road, reinforcements. The chair network was already operating. Frank had not made a single phone call, neither had Carlson, but the system designed in the 1800s, perfected through the Dust Bowl and the Depression, was already moving. Men were getting dressed. Horses were being saddled. Wagons were being loaded with water barrels, shovels, axes, and wet burlap. The chairs by the doors had eyes in them that morning, and those eyes were watching, and the men who owned those eyes were moving. They found George Henderson alive, but barely conscious on Doc Miller's examination table, his hands wrapped in bandages that were already soaking through with blood and clear fluid that meant burns deep enough to endanger tissue. Doc Miller, who was actually Frank's second cousin and not a real doctor, but had been setting bones and treating burns since 1928, looked up when Frank entered. His face told the story before his mouth did. He will live. He will not farm again this year, maybe not ever. Nerve damage in both hands. George Henderson had grabbed a metal lockbox that had been sitting 3 feet from a burning wall. The metal had heated to temperatures that melted skin on contact. He had held that box for the 15 seconds it took to get from the bedroom to the front door, and those 15 seconds had cost him the use of his hands for the rest of the harvest season, maybe forever. His wheat was still standing in the fields. His corn was 2 weeks from ready. His cattle needed tending. His farm needed working. His family needed feeding. Frank looked at Doc Miller. Doc Miller looked at Carlson. Carlson stood up from the chair he had taken by Doc Miller's door and said, "I will make the calls." He walked to the phone in the corner, cranked the handle twice, and when the operator answered, he said, "Henderson fire. George is alive, but his hands are gone. We need the chairs filled by sunset." Then he hung up. The operator would make 12 calls. Each of those 12 would make 12 more. By noon, every farmer within 20 miles would know what had happened and what was needed. By sunset, the chair network would have organized a response more sophisticated than most military operations. This was the second function of the chair-by-the-door system, and it was the one that kept rural communities alive through the Depression, when banks failed and government help moved at the speed of bureaucracy, which was to say not at all. The chair was not just for watching, it was for being found. When you needed help, you sat in your chair and you waited. People knew to look there, they knew you would be there. They knew you would be ready to receive them. And most importantly, they knew you would tell them the truth about what you needed, because the chair carried an obligation of honesty that the kitchen table did not. A man could lie to you in his kitchen. He could put on coffee and make small talk and pretend his troubles were not as bad as they were. But a man sitting in his chair by the door before dawn, or after dark, or at any time when sitting outside made no practical sense, that man was signaling distress. The chair was a flag of surrender to the community. It meant I need help, and I am admitting it in the most visible way possible. George Henderson's father had sat in his chair for 3 days straight in August of 1936, during the worst of the Dust Bowl. He had not gone inside except to sleep. He had not worked his fields. He had just sat there, And the community had understood. The farm was failing, the family was desperate. By the third day, 12 men showed up with equipment to dig a deeper well. They worked for free. They fed themselves. They asked for nothing in return except the knowledge that when their own chairs needed sitting in, George Henderson's father would come. He had come. For 23 years, until a heart attack killed him in 1959, he had come every single time someone sat in their chair waiting. That was the contract. The chair demanded mutual aid that could not be refused, could not be delayed, and could not be forgotten. You sat in your chair when you needed help. Your community came. When they sat in their chairs, you went. The system was older than money, more binding than law, and more powerful than any government program that ever existed. Frank drove back to the Henderson place with Carlson riding silent beside him, both of them knowing what they would find before they arrived. The house was still smoldering, the equipment shed was gone, and 15 men were already working to create fire breaks around the remaining structures. Frank recognized most of them. Some had driven 30 miles. None of them had been called. They had just come because that was what you did, when you saw smoke on the horizon, and you lived in a community held together by chairs and the men who sat in them. The Henderson boy, whose name was Robert and who was 14 years old, sat in a chair someone had salvaged from the house. The chair was scorched on one side. The boy sat in it anyway, positioned right where the front door used to be before the fire took it. He looked like he had been crying but had stopped. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 hours. He looked like he was waiting. Frank walked up to that chair, and he stopped 6 feet away, which was the proper distance. You did not crowd a man in his chair. You did not tower over him. You approached, you stopped, you waited to be acknowledged. Robert Henderson looked up with eyes that had seen his home burn, and his father scream, and his mother collapse sobbing, and he said, "We lost the deed papers. We lost the mortgage payment money. We lost everything that proves we own this land." Frank wanted to tell the boy it would be all right. Frank wanted to offer comfort and hope, and all the useless things people say when they have no power to change reality. But he was standing in front of a chair by the door, and that chair demanded truth, so Frank said, "How much is the mortgage payment?" $87 due in 6 days. How much did you lose in the fire? Dad kept $300 in the lockbox. Emergency money, all gone. Frank did the math in his head. The Henderson farm was 480 acres of prime wheatland, 200 head of cattle, farm equipment that had been new in 1948, and a bloodline of work ethic that went back 4 generations. The bank would foreclose over $87 because the bank did not care about bloodlines or work ethic, or the fact that George Henderson had never missed a payment in 23 years. The bank cared about contracts and deadlines, and in 6 days, without that payment, the Henderson family would lose everything. Carlson stepped up beside Frank. The old man pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, opened it and counted out 3 $20 bills. He handed them to Robert Henderson. "For the payment. Your father helped me bring in wheat in 47 when my back went out. We are even now." Robert Henderson stared at the money like it was a snake. This was the third function of the chair by the door, and it was the one that separated good men from great communities. The chair was a lending library of trust. Money could be offered at a chair that could never be offered in a kitchen or a barn or a field. The chair made the transaction public, visible, witnessed. A man who took money at his chair was obligated to repay it, not because of law, but because everyone had seen him take it. Everyone knew, everyone would remember. And if he failed to repay, his chair would be empty for the rest of his life, because no one would come when he sat in it. The chair turned borrowing into a covenant. It turned debt into honor. It turned desperation into community responsibility. Robert Henderson took the money. His hand shook. "I will pay you back." "Your father will pay me back," Carlson corrected. "After harvest, after his hands heal, after his family is fed. I will wait." 2 more men walked up. Frank recognized them as the Paulson brothers, who farmed 12 miles south and had lost their own father to a barn fire in 1944. They did not speak. They just handed Robert Henderson money, $20 from one, 15 from the other. Then they walked away to help with the firebreak. By noon, Robert Henderson had collected $143 from 17 different men. None of them asked for receipts. None of them set interest rates. None of them demanded collateral. They just gave money to a 14-year-old boy sitting in a scorched chair because that was how the system worked. The chair was a bank that ran on trust instead of contracts, and in 3 hours it had accomplished what no actual bank would have done. It had saved a farm. But the chair system demanded repayment, and that was where the fourth function came into brutal focus. The chair was a credit report that could not be hidden from, could not be disputed, and could not be forgotten. Every man who gave money that morning would remember. Every man in the community would know who had given and how much. And when George Henderson recovered, he would sit in his chair and he would repay each man individually, publicly, at the chair so everyone could see the debt discharged. If he failed, if he took the money and ran, if he tried to avoid repayment, his chair would become a monument to his shame. No one would help him again. No one would sit with him. No one would come when he needed them. The chair was a better credit system than any bank because it ran on reputation, and reputation in rural farming communities was the only currency that truly mattered. You could lose your money, you could lose your land, you could lose your health. But if you lost your reputation, you lost everything because no one would help you rebuild. Frank understood this in a way that made his chest tight. His own grandfather had loaned money to a man named Carson in 1933. Carson had taken the money at his chair. Carson had used it to buy seed. Carson had harvested a good crop. And then Carson had packed his family in the night and moved to California without repaying anyone. Frank's grandfather had found Carson's chair the next morning, pushed over on its side in the dirt. That overturned chair had been a declaration of bankruptcy, more final than any court filing. It meant Carson knew he could never come back. It meant everyone who saw that chair would know what Carson had done. It meant Carson's children would carry that shame if they ever returned to Kansas. They never did. The Henderson fire burned through the morning, but by afternoon, the men had it controlled. They saved the barn, they saved the cattle shed, they saved the chicken coop and the root cellar and the well house. They lost the house and the equipment shed, and 3 smaller outbuildings that had held tools and supplies. The damage was catastrophic but survivable, and it was survivable only because 37 men had shown up without being called to fight a fire that was not theirs on a farm they did not own for a family that could not pay them. They did it because of chairs, because of the compact those chairs represented, because they knew that someday, maybe next week, or maybe in 20 years, they would need help, and someone would come for the same reason. Martha Miller arrived at 3 in the afternoon with 2 other women and enough food to feed 40 people. She set up on a table someone had salvaged, and she did not ask permission or wait for instruction. She just started serving food to men who had been fighting fire for 11 hours. This was the 5th function of the chair system, though women executed it differently than men. A woman did not sit in the chair. That was not her role. But a woman watched the chairs, knew what they meant, knew when help was needed, and organized the response that kept the helpers alive. The women did not fight the fire. They fed the men who did. They tended burns and cuts. They watched children while parents worked. They organized sleeping arrangements for families displaced by disaster. They did all of this without committees or meetings or formal structure. They just knew because their mothers had known, and their grandmothers before them, that when the chairs filled up with trouble, the women mobilized to support the response. Martha Miller had packed food before Frank had even called her. She had seen the smoke. She had known what it meant. She had started cooking. By the time Frank's truck had disappeared down the road, she had 3 other women at her kitchen working on sandwiches, pies, and gallons of coffee. They had not needed to be told. They had just known. This was the invisible half of the chair system. The men sat in chairs and the men came to help, but the women made it possible for the men to keep coming hour after hour, day after day, week after week if necessary. The women were the supply chain that kept the chair network operational. And they did it without recognition or praise, because recognition and praise were not the point. Survival was the point. By sunset, the Henderson family had a place to sleep. Neighbors had set up cots in the barn. Women had brought blankets and pillows. Someone had rigged a washing station with barrels of heated water. It was not comfortable, it was not permanent, but it was shelter, and it would hold until something better could be arranged. Robert Henderson still sat in his scorched chair, and he would sit there until his father came home from Doc Miller's place, because that was what you did. You sat in the chair until the crisis passed, or you died. Those were the only two acceptable reasons for leaving. Frank drove home after dark, bone-tired and smoke-stained, and when he pulled up to his house, he saw Old Man Carlson sitting on the porch rail exactly where he had been that morning. The old man had been at the Henderson place all day. He had worked as hard as anyone despite being 78 years old. He had driven back to Frank's place in his own truck, and he had positioned himself exactly where he knew Frank would see him first. He had something to say, and he was going to say it at Frank's chair, which meant it was important. Frank climbed out of his truck and walked to his porch. He did not sit in his chair. He stood next to it, waiting. Carlson looked at him with eyes that had seen every kind of trouble the prairie could deliver and had survived all of it through intelligence, preparation, and the chair network that had kept rural America alive for generations. The old man said, "Your grandfather died sitting in that chair. Did you know that?" Frank had known his grandfather had died in 1949, but he had not known the details. He shook his head. Heart attack. Took him in the evening. He was watching the sunset. When your grandmother found him, he was still sitting up, eyes open, looking west. The doctor said he probably did not feel much pain. He just stopped. Carlson paused, and in that pause, Frank heard something that sounded almost like regret. He died watching for trouble that never came. Sitting in a chair he had worn smooth over 43 years, waiting to help people who did not need him that particular evening. Frank felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I sat in my chair this morning at 4:15. I saw that smoke. I knew what it meant. I could have driven straight to the Henderson place. I could have helped 20 minutes sooner. But I came to your place instead. I sat on your porch. I waited for you, because that is what the system demands. You do not respond alone. You gather first. You coordinate. You move as a group." "You did the right thing," Frank said, but he heard uncertainty in his own voice. "Did I? 20 minutes might have saved George Henderson's hands. 20 minutes might have let him grab that lockbox without burning himself. 20 minutes might have changed everything. But I followed the protocol. I waited for you, because that is what 70 years of training told me to do." Frank understood what Carlson was really saying. The chair system was not perfect. It was not magic. It was just a network of human beings trying to help each other in a world that did not care if they lived or died. And sometimes the network's protocols conflicted with immediate action. Sometimes sitting in a chair and waiting was the right choice. Sometimes it was not. The only way to know for sure was to live through it and count the cost afterward. This was the sixth function of the chair, and it was the one nobody talked about because talking about it meant admitting that the system could fail. The chair was a decision-making framework in crisis situations. It forced men to pause, gather, assess, and coordinate, instead of rushing off half-prepared to make bad situations worse. It worked 99 times out of 100. But that 100th time, that one time when immediate action was needed more than coordination, the chair could cost lives. George Henderson's hands were the price they paid for coordination that morning. It was probably worth it. Probably. The men who had gathered at Frank's place had brought the right equipment, moved efficiently, and saved structures that might have burned if people had shown up randomly with no plan. But George Henderson would never farm the same way again, and some part of that was because Carlson had spent 20 minutes sitting on Frank's porch instead of driving straight to the fire. You could torture yourself with what-ifs, or you could accept that the chair system had saved more lives than it had cost over 100 years of use. Carlson had clearly chosen acceptance, but Frank could see it had not been an easy choice. Carlson stood up from the porch rail. He walked to his truck without another word. He drove away into the darkness, leaving Frank standing next to his chair with a new understanding of what that piece of furniture meant. It was not safety. It was not certainty. It was just the best system anyone had figured out for keeping rural communities alive in a landscape that killed the unprepared, the isolated, and the unlucky. The chair gave you better odds than you would have had alone. Nothing more, nothing less. Frank sat down in his grandfather's chair for the first time since inheriting it. The wood was smooth under his hands, worn by decades of use. He could feel the notches his grandfather had carved, one for each year. He counted them slowly. 43. 43 years of watching sunsets and scanning horizons and waiting for trouble that sometimes came and sometimes did not. 43 years of being ready, being available, being part of a network that kept people alive. Frank pulled out his pocket knife. He carved a small notch in the armrest, right below his father's last mark. His first year in the chair. His first year of understanding what it meant. The seventh function of the chair was the one that mattered most and was hardest to explain. The chair was a monument to continuity. It was proof that someone had sat there before you and someone would sit there after you. It was a physical object that carried the weight of generations, and when you sat in it, you felt that weight. You felt the responsibility of everyone who had sat there before. You felt the expectation that you would pass the chair to the next generation in the same condition you received it, maybe with a few more notches, but otherwise unchanged. The chair was time made physical, history made tangible, community made visible. When you sat in your chair, you were not just one man watching one horizon. You were part of a network of watchers stretching back 100 years and forward, as far as anyone could imagine. You were connected to every farmer who had ever sat in a chair by a door and understood what it meant. Frank sat there until full dark, watching the stars come out over his wheat fields. Somewhere east, George Henderson was lying in a bed with bandaged hands, facing a future that had changed completely in the hours since dawn. Somewhere north, Carlson was probably sitting in his own chair, thinking about choices made and costs paid. Somewhere in all directions, men were sitting in chairs or getting ready to sit in them, maintaining a network that most of the country had never heard of and would never understand. The next morning, Frank was sitting in his chair at sunrise when he saw a truck coming up his road. It was Robert Henderson, driving his father's vehicle with hands that barely looked old enough to reach the pedals. The boy parked and walked to the porch, stopping at the proper distance. He looked exhausted. He looked determined. He looked like he had learned something important overnight. "My father wants to thank you, and Mr. Carlson and everyone who came. He says as soon as his hands heal, he will start repaying the loans, but he wanted me to tell you something else too." Frank waited. He said to tell you that he should have been sitting in his chair that morning. He said if he had been, he might have seen the fire start. He might have caught it when it was just the equipment shed. He said he was inside making coffee and he was not watching. He said that was his mistake, and he will not make it again. Frank understood. George Henderson was claiming responsibility for his own disaster in the most public way possible. He was saying that the chair system had not failed him. He had failed the chair system by not being in position to watch for danger. It was probably not true. A fire that started at 4 in the morning could not have been prevented by a man sitting in a chair at dawn. But truth was less important than the message Henderson was sending. He was telling the community that he still believed in the system. He still trusted the chairs. He would be back in his chair as soon as he could sit there again. That message would spread through the network faster than the news of the fire had. Men would hear it and feel reassured. The system still worked. The chairs still mattered. The community was still intact. Robert Henderson drove away before Frank could respond, which was proper. "You delivered your message at a man's chair and then you left. You did not wait for reaction or discussion. The chair was not a conversation place. It was a declaration place." Frank sat in his chair and he thought about the 100 ways the system could have failed that morning and the one way it had actually worked. Imperfectly, expensively, but worked nonetheless. George Henderson would keep his farm. His family would survive. His son had learned what the chair meant. The knowledge would pass to another generation. The network would hold. The chair by the door was not one thing. It was 7 systems compressed into furniture. It was a watchtower, a distress signal, a lending library, a credit report, a supply chain coordinator, a decision framework, and a monument to continuity. It worked because everyone understood all 7 functions and honored all 7 obligations. You watched, you admitted need, you loaned freely, you repaid honestly, you supported the supporters, you paused to coordinate, you carved your notch and passed the chair forward. Break any one of those 7 functions and the whole system collapsed. Keep all 7 intact and you could survive anything the prairie threw at you. Drought, dust, fire, flood, economic collapse, personal disaster. The chairs would hold because the men in them held and the women behind them held and the children watching them learned to hold. Frank Miller sat in his chair every morning and every evening for the next 32 years. He carved a notch for each one. When his son took over the farm in 1985, Frank handed him the chair and explained all 7 functions. The son listened. The son understood. The son added his own notches. The chair still sits by that door today, though the farm has changed hands, and the man sitting in it never knew Frank Miller or George Henderson or Old Man Carlson. But he knows what the chair means. He knows to watch. He knows to help. He knows to sit when he needs support and stand when others need him. He knows that the chair is older than he is and will outlast him, and that is exactly how it should be. The chair by the door was never about furniture. It was about survival. It was about creating a network of mutual aid that could function without government, without banks, without formal organization. It was about giving isolated people a system for staying connected, when connection meant the difference between life and death. It worked for 100 years in rural America, and pieces of it still work today, anywhere people understand that community is not something you join. It is something you build, one chair at a time, one notch at a time, one generation at a time. Thank you for watching this video about a piece of American farming history that most people have never heard of, but that kept families alive through some of the hardest years this country has ever seen. If you found this story valuable, please hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this with anyone who might appreciate learning about the wisdom built into rural American communities. These stories matter. These systems mattered. The people who built them deserve to be remembered. This video is inspired by real events and does not aim to represent or offend anyone. Frank Miller is a representative character, reflecting the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during the 1930s through 1970s era. The chair-by-the-door system described here was practiced in various forms across rural American communities, and the specific details have been compiled from historical accounts, oral histories, and documented farming practices of that period.